In the last video, we explored the repercussions for theories of the human person for various issues at the beginning stages of life. We looked at Lynn Rudder Baker's psychological approach and how she applies it to the issue of abortion, arguing that abortion is not morally impermissible because that which is in the womb is not the same kind of thing that we are. Now, in these next two episodes, what I want to explore are the repercussions for theories of the human person at the other end, at the end of life. So the concentrating question here is, when does a person die? Some of the ethical issues that might be involved have to do with euthanasia, have to do with advance directives, and have to do with organ donation. Well, when we can say that the human person has died depends a lot on what we think the human person is. And so here too, we'll see arguments wielded from a particular theory of the human person to particular ethical conclusions in this domain. And the first piece that I want to look at is Jeff McMahan's article, in which he argues, sort of in a similar kind of way as Lynn Rudder Baker argued for the permissibility of abortion from when she thinks human persons begin, which is based on her theory of the human person. She argued against other theories of the human person so as to supplement that. Here, Jeff McMahan in his short piece is going to do something very similar at the end of life. The ethical issue that he's most interested in is organ donation or organ harvesting. So the general idea is that you can, based on the dead donor rule, is that you can only take the organs from an organ donor once that donor has died. And so it depends quite a bit on how we define death. And how we define death will depend a lot on how we define the nature of the human person. So what's at stake here is, based on the dead donor rule, you cannot take organs from someone who hasn't died yet. So depending on your theory of death, right, this could be at various stages towards of the end of the person's life. The way that McMahan is going to run through his article then is he's going to have sort of the same four stages as Lynn Rudder Baker had in hers. First, he's going to articulate, he does it kind of reverse, but we could do it this way. He's going to articulate his theory of the human person. Then he's going to establish when the human person ceases to exist or dies on his theory of the human person. Then he's going to compare and contrast his view against other leading views of the human person, arguing that his view is superior. And then he's going to reach some ethical conclusions with respect to organ harvesting. He's going to try to argue that it is permissible to harvest organs from any human organism that has fallen into a persistent vegetative state or has suffered serious damage to his cerebral cortex, because whatever remains after such an injury is not a person, is not the same sort of thing that we are. So let's sort through then his theory of the human person. Maybe we'll do this kind of negatively by going through the views that he considers, that he rejects, and why he rejects them. So first thing McMahan says is that we are not animals. He wants to reject the biological approach. He wants to reject any claim that says that we are identical to human animals. And he gives two arguments or two reasons for thinking that we are not animals. And both of these arguments should be pretty familiar to us by now. The first one he gives is the transplant intuition, the general idea that most of us have a strong inclination to think that if you were to relocate your cerebrum to another body, you would go with it. But the animal doesn't go with it, and so therefore you are not the animal. That's the transplant intuition. We spent several classes talking about how that transplant intuition is articulated and how it's wielded against all views that aren't sort of psychological in nature. The other argument that McMahan gives for thinking that we are not animals is his case of conjoined twins, the dicephalous case. We spent a class talking about the conjoined twins objection to animalism as well. The general idea is that on animalism, persons are organisms. So in any case, you can't have more persons than there are organisms, or more organisms than there are persons. Or at least not more organisms than there are the sort of thing that we are. But it looks like in some cases of conjoined twins, those numbers aren't going to be even 1-to-1. So in the case of a dicephalous case, now remember this is the sort of case in which they share a body, but there are two heads, or to put it sort of less controversially, what we have is one single body, but we've got two heads, two brains, two spheres of consciousness. So what McMahan wants to argue is that in the dicephalous case, it looks like we have just one animal, but because we have two spheres of consciousness, because we have two brains, it looks clearly like we would treat like there as being two persons, as was illustrated in the case of the Hensel twins. Clearly two persons, less clearly two organisms. And so McMahan is wielding this argument too against animalism, arguing that we can't be identical to animals because some of the persons that we recognize share an animal, share an organism. And so the persons can't be that organism. They must just be both associated with one single organism. So those two arguments then, the transplant intuition and the dicephalous case, are the two main arguments that McMahan uses to try to argue against animalism. So it doesn't think that animalism is right. What are we? We're not animals, according to McMahan. Okay, well then what are we? Next he considers substance dualism, and in particular maybe a version of pure substance dualism, according to which we are our souls. And he gives an argument against this claim, not a familiar argument to me, but I'll read what he says, and then we can puzzle about what his main complaint is about substance dualism. He says, if I am right that we are not organisms, what are we? The most widely held alternative view is that each of us is essentially a Cartesian soul, that is, a non-material conscious entity that in life is linked with a particular brain and body, but at death continues to exist and indeed remains conscious and is psychologically continuous with the person prior to death. Because the soul, so conceived, is non-physical, it can be individuated only by reference to a single field of consciousness. Thus, any conscious state that is not accessible in my field of consciousness must belong to a different person or soul. This conception of the soul is, however, undermined by what we know about the results of hemispheric commiserotomy, a procedure in which the tissues connecting a patient's cerebral hemispheres are surgically severed. This procedure gives rise, at least in certain experimental settings, to two separate centers of consciousness in a single human organism. If persons were Cartesian souls, we would have to conclude that the procedure creates two persons where formerly there was only one. Since this is clearly not what happens, we cannot be Cartesian souls. So he's got these split brain cases, not in which you split the brain and separate it into two bodies, but when you split the brain right down the middle, right in. So it's the commiserotomy cases, when you sever the corpus callosum that links the two cerebral hemispheres, such that there now begin to be kind of two streams of consciousness. Now, he's wielding this as an argument against substance dualism. It was a bit curious to me, but here seems to be how he's arguing. He seems to be saying that according to substance dualism, souls are presented as streams of consciousness. In other words, they aren't just the consciousness, but for every consciousness we have a soul, and for every soul we have just one stream of consciousness. And so if in these commiserotomy cases we have two streams of consciousness, they'd have to say that there are two souls and so two persons. But he thinks that that's clearly the wrong result, and so therefore substance dualism must be false. I find this curious because it seems to me like on his own account, he's going to have to say that severing the corpus callosum results in two distinct persons in the same body. It's not clear to me why this is a special worry for substance dualism, but that's what he says. So he's given two arguments against animalism, the transplant intuition and the dicephalous case, and then he gives this commiserotomy case as an apparent counterexample to substance dualism. So what's left? What are we on his view? He says in this paper that what we are embodied minds, or functioning cerebra. Now, we've seen McMahan's view once already. He was one of the authors that introduced us to these puzzles of conjoined twins towards animalism. And there we saw he described his view as the view according to which we are like thinking parts of organisms. He describes it differently in this paper, but it's the same sort of view. The general idea is that you are the smallest part of your brain capable of supporting conscious thought. And so you only exist when that is there and when it's functioning properly. You're not there before we have a functioning cerebrum, and you're not there after the functioning cerebrum is already gone. So what he's done is he's establishing what theory of the human person he thinks is the right one, the thinking part view. And he thinks that the main competitors to the thinking part view, animalism and substance dualism, are false for the reasons that he's given. So he's tried to support his own view of the human person. And according to this view of the human person, you are there whenever there is a functioning cerebrum, and you are not there beforehand, and you're not there after. So then how should we define death, or when does a person cease to exist on his view? Well, here we have to distinguish between, again, a metaphysical criterion and an epistemological criterion. A metaphysical criterion is what fact is out there in the world that makes it the case that you have ceased to exist. An epistemological criterion would be how we are able to reliably judge that those conditions obtain, that the person has indeed ceased to exist. So he offers both a metaphysical criterion for death, what would have to take place in order for the death to occur, and an epistemological criterion. In other words, what is the most reliable method for determining that this has occurred? So his metaphysical criterion for death is that a person dies when there is an irreversible loss of the capacity for consciousness. And he thinks that this happens in, for example, a persistent vegetative state or other serious injuries. But he thinks that this could happen without the full death of the organism. In other words, what he's looking for here is that you die when some part of the higher brain loses its functionality. So his epistemological criterion for death, then, how we can tell whether the person has died, we look for higher brain death. We look for whether the cerebral cortex, whether that has been damaged severely enough that it's unreasonable to think that functionality is ever going to come back to that organ. So his view, we are thinking parts, we are functioning cerebra, we are embodied minds, and we cease to exist. Our death consists in the irreversible loss of capacity for consciousness, which is most ably demonstrated when the patient suffers higher brain death. In other words, when they permanently lose functionality in their higher brain, the cerebral cortex. So then he draws various practical implications from this. So far he's pitched what his view is, argued against other competing views, argued that his view has a particular view of when a person can be said to die, and then he draws various ethical implications from this. The one that he spends the most time talking about in this paper is the issue of organ transplantation. Once again, according to the dead donor rule, you cannot remove organs from a patient, certainly not any of the organs that are required for the continued metabolic function of the organism. You cannot draw any of the organs from a patient unless the patient has died. Once the patient has died and they have agreed to donate their organs, then those organs can be harvested and redistributed to save other people's lives. But if the patient isn't dead yet, you can't take them. You can't take even if the person has agreed to donate their lungs or their heart, you cannot take the lungs or the heart if the patient hasn't died yet. It doesn't matter if they're on the way to death, if they haven't died yet, you cannot take them. But in McMahan's view, a patient dies when they suffer higher brain death, when they suffer irreversible loss of capacity for consciousness, when there is irreparable harm done to their cerebral cortex. And so what he thinks follows from this is that any patients who are in such a state, if they have suffered higher brain death, if they've fallen into a persistent vegetative state, if they've suffered some serious injury to their higher brain, and if they've agreed to be organ donors, then we can, and he thinks, indeed maybe we morally ought, to retrieve those organs, to harvest those organs from whatever is left, and to use them to save other lives. Now, wait a second, you might say. Well, wait a second. If you can have the loss of the higher brain function, but still have the brainstem functioning just fine, and so you can have a living organism there, even after higher brain death. So what McMahan is saying is that even though there is a living, breathing human organism there, the person is not there, and so you're free to take the organs to save the lives of other persons. So that's the ethical implication that he draws. It's not morally impermissible to take the organs from someone who has fallen in persistent vegetative state. Why? Because the person is no longer there. All that's left is the human organism, which the human person is not identical to. And so just as Lynn Rutter Baker wanted to draw ethical conclusions for the permissibility of abortion based on the fact that the fetus is not the same sort of thing as us. What McMahan wants to draw is that in the case of persistent vegetative state patients, right, the person is gone. They are not the same category of thing as we are, and so therefore it would be morally permissible to take their organs in order to save the lives of other persons. He doesn't draw other conclusions as much in this paper, but it might also follow that it's not morally impermissible to pull a plug for any reason. If the person's gone, why are you continuing to provide food and other means of support for this human organism that isn't your loved one? We know it might also apply to the issue of advance directives. So advance directives are when you sign something that's saying that if I were ever to suffer this sort of injury, I would like this sort of care. I would not like to receive these sort of extraordinary means, and so please do not give them to me. But notice that advance directives only apply, right? There's an implicit I built into them if it's not explicit. The idea is that if I am no longer there, then what I have requested be done to me need not apply. So if I'm already dead, if the person is no longer there, then even if they had advance directives that they'd like to receive this sort of extraordinary care, they're no longer there. So we're under no more obligation to continue to give that care to the organism that they are not identical to. Okay, so then we can draw all sorts of ethical conclusions from McMahan's account of when the human person dies, which is drawn from his account of what the human person is. And so if we wanted to disagree with this, if we wanted to say that no, that can't possibly be morally right, then in order to argue that it isn't morally right, I think once again, you'd have to go back and have to argue against his theory of the human person. You'd have to do a whole bunch of metaphysics. If you want to argue that it's impermissible to draw the organs from patients in a persistent vegetative state, you'd have to establish that they are indeed the same patients that were there before. And so you have to come up with some reasons for thinking that McMahan's view of the human person, the thinking parts view, is not the right one. So what are some possible objections to McMahan's view? We've been considering McMahan's view for several classes now. We were confronted or introduced to the thinking part view earlier on when we looked at the thinking parts problem, but especially when we looked at the conjoined twins view and also the remnant person problem. So what are some possible objections to the thinking parts view? Well, maybe we can focus on particular its account of death. Maybe there are some implausible repercussions already of his theory of death. So he says that the person dies when he or she suffers an irreversible loss for the capacity for consciousness. Here we've got something like an irreversibility clause right in the definition of death. But irreversibility clauses in conceptions of death are notoriously difficult to establish and notoriously difficult to spell out in detail and what exactly that means. So irreversible means, right, that if the patient dies on the operating table and then is brought back to life, if you have an irreversibility clause in your definition of death, because it was reversed, it means it wasn't irreversible. It means that the patient never actually died. But doesn't irreversibility depend a little bit on what the people actually do when the heart stops? Doesn't it depend on what sort of technology is available to the person about whether it's reversible or not? Doesn't irreversibility depend a little bit on the technology that we have around us? I think it might, and this is one of the biggest worries about an irreversibility clause for the definition of death. But we also might wonder, like, what it would mean to irreversibly lose the capacity for consciousness. What exactly does that mean? Does that mean that that you can't possibly, by your own means, repair yourself? So some things that go wrong with the human body, the body can repair itself. Sometimes a minor cut, it can repair itself. Sometimes even damage to the brain can be fixed on its own. Maybe other parts of the brain pick up the slack, or it can repair itself in other ways. So how irreversible is the loss of capacity for consciousness in a persistent vegetative state? There are cases in which patients who were diagnosed as being in persistent vegetative state have sort of, seemingly miraculously, on their own accord, woken up from it. Or it could be that we develop the means to be able to repair the higher brains of patients who have fallen in such a state. Or it might be possible to transplant particular pieces of the brain from elsewhere into this person so as to allow them once again to have that capacity. Now, because there are these possibilities of self-repair, of external repair, and of transplant, this really complicates the picture of what it really means to irreversibly lose the capacity for consciousness. Does that mean it's no way possible for it to self-repair? Does that mean it's not at all possible for it to be repaired from the outside? That it is not possible at all for it to even gain it through transplant? Because there are all sorts of possibilities on how we could get the consciousness back. It's not clear exactly what would fall under the irreversible loss of capacity for consciousness. As our technology gets better, how exactly do we spell that out? The other thing we might worry about is, well, wait a second. The capacity for consciousness, does a human organism ever lose the full capacity for consciousness? Think back to the way in which Patrick Toner distinguishes between three ways in which something can be considered rational. It can be considered rational in the operational sense, that is currently operating rationally. It can be rational in the in-hand capacity sense. In other words, that it's rational, it's ready to go, right? Just wake it up, right, and it'll immediately start acting rationally. Or something can be rational in the natural capacity sense. For something to be rational in the natural capacity sense is for it to have a developmental trajectory, which ordinarily results in the overt usage of rational capacities, and that it will develop them unless something gets in the way or something harms it. And in this case, what we have in a persistent vegetative is something is getting in the way, something is harming it. It has suffered some sort of injury, but has it lost its natural capacity for developing these things? Arguably not. Arguably, right, it's just prevented from realizing those capacities for developing consciousness. It has been prevented from realizing it by the injury, by the situation. And so we might think that as soon as you introduce it to the capacity for consciousness, we need to know exactly what you mean by capacity and why a natural capacity isn't enough. Doesn't the human organism always have, in some sense, a capacity for consciousness, just not an in-hand capacity? Well, what are some other potential worries for the thinking parts view? Maybe we can rehearse now some of the ones we know from our previous discussion of this sort of view. Now, the thinking parts view is one of the major upshots, McMahan says, is that it can provide a solution to the thinking parts problem. That it looks like there are too many candidates for the think of your thoughts. How do you get just one? The way McMahan argued is that you get one by just identifying it with the smallest part of your brain that is capable of supporting conscious thought. And all the other ones are thinkers, only in the sense that they have a part which thinks in the full sense. Now, Olson goes back and forth about whether this actually solves the problem. We're still going to have too many thinkers. It's still true that the animal thinks, right? So we've actually got this competition in the way to describe it. Does the part think, and does the animal think only in the sense that it has a part that thinks? Or is it the whole animal that thinks, and the brain only thinks in the sense that it is the instrument or the tool by means of which the animal thinks? You might think that because these are sort of equally plausible strategies, the thinking parts view actually hasn't actually gotten around the problem of too many thinkers. Because it's equally plausible to describe the whole animal as thinking as it is the smallest part, it seems like we still got a puzzle about which one is actually doing the thinking. You might also think that his view is kind of curious, especially his account of death, because it means that in some cases, right, when a human person dies, there are actually two deaths involved. There is the higher brain death, and then later on, it might be quite a while later on, there is the death of the organism. So when we talk about death, what McMahan's view entails is that there are two kinds of death, and so in some cases there are two deaths that occur. There's the first death of the person, there's the death of the organism. But we might think that this is a problem of too many deaths, that we ought to think that there is really just one death involved, however we understand it. But it looks like if you say that the death is not the death of the organism, then you're going to have to introduce too many deaths, two deaths, whereas we ordinarily would want to say that there's really just one. Are there other objections to the thinking parts view? I still think it's going to have a problem about the double transplant of the cerebrum, even though if you're the smallest part of your brain that can support conscious thought. Aren't there several of those in your head right now? And couldn't we put them in different bodies? And so which one would be you? There's the problem about how it means that a lot of things that we say about ourselves are literally false. That you've never seen your mother, you've never played basketball, um, that you've never listened to your favorite song. You are a small, very part of the brain, and so, and your mother is a very small part of her brain, and so you've never really seen your mother. You've never played basketball, though you are associated with something that has, and you've never listened to your favorite song, though you are connected to an organism that has listened to your favorite song. And so, I think a major worry for the thinking parts of you is that it makes a lot of things that we say about ourselves, strictly speaking, false. Now, this might also be a worry for pure substance dualism, but it's a worry for thinking parts of you nonetheless. And so if any of these objections are any good to the thinking parts view, you might have a good response to McMahan's argument that harvesting the organs from patients in persistent vegetative states is morally permissible. Because if you can undermine his theory of the human person, then you can undermine his account for when the human person dies. And if you undermine his account for when the human person dies, then you undermine his conclusion that patients in a persistent vegetative state are not the same kinds of thing as us, and so we don't have the same moral obligations we do to ourselves or things like us. If you can undermine all that and replace it with a theory of the human person that says, no, patients in persistent vegetative state are still persons, then you've got a stronger metaphysical foundation for the claim that it would be morally impermissible to harvest the organs from such a being. What I want to do next time is I want to look at the bigger picture, the bigger debate over various theories of the human person with respect to when we can say that a human person dies.